Hello and welcome to UWO Now. UWO Now is the place where we talk about relevant and interesting topics with the students, staff, faculty, and alumni at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. In September, Queen Elizabeth II passed. She was 96 years old, and here to talk to us about our fascination with the royals and why many people care about what they do, about their lives and their relevance and importance to the people of the UK is Michael Rutz, who is the chair of the history department at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. Thanks so much, Michael, for coming by and talking to us today.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure to be here.
Before we talk about the royals, let's talk about you. What's your path to UWO? How did you get here? And what is your area of concentration that you teach or that you research at UWO?
Sure. Well, I've been at UWO now. This is the start of my 20th year. I came here in 2002, joined the history department. Prior to that, I'm a Midwesterner by background. I grew up in Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan, went to the University of Michigan for undergrad and did my graduate work at Washington University in St. Louis when I finished my PhD there in British and African history. In 2002, I was fortunate enough to be offered the opportunity to come here to UWO and join the department. I got into doing British history, I suppose, through a kind of interest, as probably many folks do, the early history of the United States and the American Revolution and that kind of time period. And
okay.
As an undergrad, I got a little interested in thinking about what was happening in the UK on the other side around that time. We sort of hear about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the various figures connected to kind of what was happening over here, but what was going on over there? What did people over there think about it? And that got me into doing some undergraduate research related to the history of the UK in the late 1700s. And from there, it just kind of spiraled into going to graduate school and working on a doctorate and doing British history. And here I am.
Yeah. And now the most wanted man on campus to provide some information about the royals and who they are and why they are, who they are, and all that goes along with it. There seems to be, and always has been, I think, just not knowing anything, but just what I observe, a high level of interest with the royal family. And as I mentioned, who they are, what they're doing, why they're doing it, all the intrigue and mystery surrounding the people who occupy these positions going back in history centuries. What is it about their particular family that intrigues the world?
It's a good question. I think today part of it is just the nature of celebrity, right? They're prominent figures. They have had a long-standing role as public figures. And so part of it is in a celebrity age, famous people get attention. And so I think that's part of it. But I think for Queen Elizabeth II and to some degree for the royal family as well, there's a broader appeal that comes from the kind of longevity of it, right? She was a figure on the world stage for 70 years.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back to essentially the origins of the monarchy in early medieval England, we're talking about 1,000-year history of the crown. So that longevity, I think, is something that sparks a kind of interest and curiosity. Who are these people and what is this office that has been around for such a long time, that has been kind of this fixture? And in a sense, kind of what is its staying power, I think is an interesting sort of question that sort of piques people's curiosity. And, I think for us as Americans, given our historical ties to the UK, there's a little bit of a kind of fascination that's at work there too. Like these could have been our, leading figures as well, if not for, what happened in 1776 and onward. And so that historical connection probably also makes Americans sort of, in some ways, I think, kind of curious to know sort of what's going on with the royal family and with the monarchy.
Now, that's what's going on in America and how we feel about it, and maybe even the broader international community may feel the same way. But how about in the UK? Mm-hmm. Talk about this image, this relevance of the royal family today, mm-hmm. In the 2000s. Why does it still? What's the relevance of the royal family in Great Britain today, and what's the position there?
Yeah. Well, it's obviously a position that's changed enormously over the course of history, in particular the last 400 or 500 years, right? The monarch was, for a long period of time, the political ruler and supreme sort of power and authority.
And when did that stop? When did that basically stop?
That's a tricky question. Mm-hmm. You could argue going all the way back to the 13th century and Magna Carta, when the mm-hmm. king's barons rose up and first sort of articulated the idea that there were limitations on the power of the crown, that at least those who were prominent men in English society had certain rights that the crown couldn't encroach upon. I mean, you move forward from there to the 17th century, the Civil War, the Glorious Revolution. That's when this institution of Parliament begins to kind of assert itself as taking a prominent role in the actual exercising of political power. And it's really by the early 1800s, maybe a couple hundred years ago, that we finally start to kind of see that final transition where kind of democratic style institutions, representative institutions behind the idea of Parliament begin to kind of assert this is where actual political decision making is really going to happen, and the monarch begins to shift more to that just sort of ceremonial kind of role. Now, that ceremonial role still has significance and importance in the sense that—
And power?
Not power in the sense of exercising political decision-making, right? And in fact, the monarch really now is expected to sort of put up a face of neutrality and not express their own political opinions and not exercise political power. What the monarch does still have is a kind of ceremonial importance and power. And I guess what I mean by that is that one of the unique things about the UK is that they, like us, they do not have, I should say, unlike us, they do not have a written constitution. Right? We have a constitution which sort of spells out, mm-hmm. here's in writing our rights, the government's powers, the limitations on those powers, the divisions of that power. Again, going back to that idea that the crown has been around for over 1,000 years, in Britain, it's been more of a kind of, we do things the way that we've sort of always done them and we just keep doing them. So nobody ever wrote that down in a kind of like, here's a real documented, right? Again, there are key moments, the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights from 1688. But they take a kind of pride in this unwritten constitution. We do the things that we've traditionally done and we continue to do them, and that gives a kind of legitimacy to them. And the crown does play an important role there, even if it's now just ceremonial. The Queen, or going forward now the King, right, will appear at the opening of Parliament and all dressed up and sit there and read a speech that's written by the government and doesn't express his or her own political views. It's just performing the ceremony. And in a sense, if you think of the operations of the government as kind of like a machine, the monarch still is sort of one of the cogs that kind of helps that all go by way of being there at the particular appointed times to go through the ceremonial actions that kind of keep things moving forward. And I suppose this is pertinent just to looking at last week, right? The last sort of public appearance and the sort of last image of Elizabeth II was her meeting with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, the outgoing and the incoming new prime minister, right? Now, unlike 300 years ago, the Queen doesn't choose who they want to be the prime minister anymore. But that idea that the legitimacy of that transfer of power comes not from like a constitutional oath like we do with our presidents, but from the formal act of meeting with the Queen and the Queen saying, yes, you can form a government, right? So the monarch doesn't exercise power in a real political sense anymore, but they kind of play this important role of keeping the traditional operation of things going.
And is that unique in the world?
It's a little bit unique, I think. I think that if you were to look at other constitutional monarchies or say other European nations that have monarchs, they will do some similar kinds of things. But I think the kind of longevity with which you could argue there's a kind of 1,000-year-long tradition that you're drawing here on the British Crown does make it a little bit unique and a little bit different. There's certainly a kind of permanence to the sense of the British monarchy that doesn't quite exist for other European nations that still have monarchs that form that play that kind of ceremonial role. I read something on Thursday when the news was breaking and so forth, right, that someone made the comment that, someone had come up to them and said, the Queen died. And they knew exactly who this person was talking about, right? There's only kind of one, the Queen, in a sense, even though there are obviously monarchs and queens in other, say, European nations and so forth. So I think that longevity and, it harkens back to the old sort of global power of Britain, does put it on a kind of unique and different level.
I want to talk a little bit about that as well. You're listening to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray. Dr. Michael Rutz, chair of the history department at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, is our guest today. Now, you mentioned that there is this face of neutrality. Certainly that, I think, Queen Elizabeth II certainly kept up. Do you anticipate Charles will continue that? Or people have wondered what his reign will be like. Will he just be a continuation of his mother, or will he modernize some approaches and relationships to the people of the United Kingdom?
My guess is that it's going to be a little bit of both. And I think if you were to take a look at now he's made a couple of public speeches and statements over the last few days. And I think if you look at those, you can see that it's going to be a little bit of both. If you listen to the words that he's saying, you hear a lot about the way in which his mother saw the role of the monarch and the way in which she was dedicated to performing her public service, to fulfilling her duties and obligations, and performing that kind of neutrality, so that the monarch can be a symbol for all Britons to look at, right? Not just one particular faction or one particular group. And he was very explicit in saying, I will continue this. I will do the same as she did. And I think that's genuine. I think it's partly calculated on his part as well, right? Mm-hmm. I think he understands that he comes to the throne with maybe not quite the same kind of sentiment of popularity and warm feelings that his mother had for various reasons. And so I think in continuity, you will see him very much leaning into the idea of expressing, I am going to do the same sorts of things that my mother did. And he even said explicitly, I realize that being the sovereign was the term that he used, being the monarch, is different from what I've been doing for the rest of my life. And so I think you will see some of his outspokenness and political points of views moderated, but where I think you will maybe see some change, and we saw this again in the last few days as well, the actual sort of ceremony of the accession, the sort of proclamation of his status as the new king, and the accession council, as it's called, which was this sort of official group that gives its approval, so to speak, to that change of power, was televised live for the first time, right, ever. And so I think you will say maybe some things like that of like, we're going to try to kind of open up and make a little bit more transparent some of these sorts of things to make the monarchy seem more accessible. But I think Charles also knows that on some level, what kept the kind of stability of his mother's popularity was that kind of steadfast, sort of neutral commitment to her public duty and obligations. And I think he'll try to emulate that to try to earn some of that same kind of goodwill.